I'd like to start by thanking both Brookings and KRINS for the opportunity to be here again. I'm a bit of an orphan. I'm the only American from the Heritage Foundation here. I think it's particularly kind of General Lee to continue to invite my American colleagues and I, because despite all the many years that we've been coming, we still haven't solved North Korea. But next year, sir, I think next year is the magic year. Denuclearization negotiations, as all my predecessors have said, have stalled. But despite that, the two Koreas moved quickly to improve bilateral relations prior to any progress on denuclearization. South Korean officials have told their U.S. counterparts that Seoul wants to separate engagement with North Korea from the denuclearization process. And as a result, the U.S. is increasingly concerned about President Moon's policies towards North Korea. Washington perceives that Seoul is getting too far ahead of its ally by prioritizing improving relations over denuclearization. And the Moon administration has had to be pulled back both through public and private messages from Washington, according to U.S. officials. And now, while the focus has been on denuclearization, Washington and Seoul must not lose sight of the massive North Korean conventional forces that threaten both South Korea and U.S. forces that are stationed here. Now, Seoul has advocated providing massive economic benefits to Pyongyang. President Moon has resurrected the progressive theory that providing North Korea with economic and diplomatic benefits will hopefully eventually lead to Pyongyang moving away from its hostile policies. The Moon administration has promised a lengthy and ever-growing list of massive economic benefits requiring North Korea, before North Korea even begins to comply with the 11 UN Security Council resolutions that require it to abandon its nuclear, missile, biological, chemical warfare programs. All of Seoul's economic plans would violate UN sanctions and/or U.S. law if they were to be implemented. The Moon administration has also repeatedly advocated for reducing international sanctions on North Korea, or that South Korea be provided with exemptions from the existing laws. In response, the U.S. has felt it necessary to repeatedly caution South Korea on required sanctions enforcement. The U.S. Treasury Department felt it necessary to directly contact 7 South Korean banks, including state-owned banks, to warn them that engaging in financial cooperation with North Korea would violate UN and U.S. financial sanctions. The U.S. government also reached out to South Korean government agencies and chaebol to remind them to uphold the law. And the U.S. warned Seoul that it would withdraw its support for inter-Korean projects if any sanctions violations were discovered. Seoul was also rebuffed by the international community on sanctions exemptions. The UN Committee on North Korean Sanctions emphasized that its exemption for the inter-Korean railroad survey was limited to the survey mission only, and that delivery of any goods to North Korea or modernizing or reconnecting the railway would violate sanctions. President Moon's request to lower sanctions or shortcut rules to provide financing to North Korea were rejected by the United Kingdom, France, ASEAN, the World Bank, and IMF, to name a few. They all declared that sanctions should be maintained until significant denuclearization had taken place, and at this point it was premature to discuss providing assistance to the regime. In September 2018, the two Koreas signed the Comprehensive Military Agreement to ease military tension and build confidence. And the CMA is laudable for taking steps to lengthen the fuse of war by reducing the danger of inadvertent tactical military clashes along the DMZ, which could otherwise escalate into larger strategic conflicts. However, static defensive positions such as fixed concrete bunkers and minefields are not threatened, nor are they the source of past military clashes or tensions on the peninsula. The greatest danger of armed conflict is from North Korea's forces, their forward, offensively oriented disposition, the regime's threats to the South and its allies, and the history of initiating hostilities. It's North Korea, not South Korea or the United States, which has repeatedly attacked the other side since 1950. And the confidence-building measures in the Comprehensive Military Agreement that have been implemented to date have not reduced the North Korean tactical or strategic conventional military threat, nor do they represent any progress in denuclearization. If South Korea thinks lowering its defenses makes itself safer, What are Seoul's next steps? Remove counter-battery radars against North Korean artillery, to reduce the THAAD and all South Korean missile defense systems, end South Korea's development of its medium and long-range surface-to-air missile defensive systems, or end the procurement of SM-3 and 6 missiles, which would defend South Korea against the North Korean submarine-launched ballistic missile threat. Following the Singapore summit, President Trump unilaterally decided to end Allied military exercises. And since then, at least 9 exercises have been canceled. That was a horrendous mistake. That decision has been the gift that keeps on giving for North Korea. Since last June, as I mentioned, they've canceled 9 exercises, which risk degrading our ability to deter and defend against a North Korean threat. The Inter-Korean Comprehensive Military Agreement also has constrained Allied military forces. Live-fire artillery exercises in both the West and East Seas were canceled because of that agreement. The South Korean K-9 artillery on Yeongyang-do must now move to the peninsula in order to train. Yet North Korea's 4th Corps artillery, which attacked Yeongyang-do in 2010, killing 4 South Korean citizens, are not affected by the Inter-Korean Agreement. South Korea closed the only long-range artillery practice range in Gangwon province, and the Allies can no longer conduct close air support of Allied ground force exercises in the frontline areas because of the new restrictions in the agreement. And at the request of the South Korean government, the U.S. will stop flying strategic bombers over the Korean peninsula, and that ground force regimental drills will have to be held outside of South Korea. These Allied self-imposed constraints have not been reciprocated by North Korea. Pyongyang has not constrained or canceled any military exercises, including its annual large-scale winter training cycle, which is going on now. And North Korea is also using the Inter-Korean agreements to try to impede additional Allied defensive measures which go beyond the scope of the accords, such as battalion-level exercises, and even South Korea's planned increased defense budget was criticized by the regime as an outright violation of North-South declarations and military agreements. Canceling exercises have consequences. Militaries need to train to maintain proficiency. They must also train on the terrain and at the echelon at which they would be required to fight. My Heritage Foundation colleague, a retired Army 3-star, Lieutenant General Thomas Spohr, assessed that, quote, suspending these large-scale joint exercises for an extended period of time, particularly for more than 6 months, could erode the readiness of U.S. and South Korean forces to successfully work together to defend South Korea. And what utility has canceling these Allied exercises had? They did not lead to progress in the denuclearization talks, nor a pause in North Korean production of nuclear weapons and missiles. There's also a danger in prematurely signing a peace declaration. After pocketing Trump's concession to cancel the exercises, Pyongyang now argues that a peace declaration ending the Korean War is first required to reduce tensions and improve relations prior to it taking any steps towards denuclearization. More troubling, however, is South Korea's enthusiastic advocacy of Pyongyang's strategy. Moon adopted Pyongyang's interpretation of joint summit statements by putting the responsibility on the United States for further steps. Rather than pressing North Korea to comply with UN resolutions, South Korean officials continually call for Allied concessions. Never mentioned are actions required of North Korea. South Korean officials downplayed concerns over the ramification of declaring an end to the Korean War by highlighting that the document would only be symbolic, it's political, it wouldn't have any real effect or consequences. But those advocates of signing a peace declaration have yet to identify any tangible benefits to signing a peace declaration, nor a specific quid pro quo that North Korea would give in return for signing the document, nor the expected change in North Korean policy or behavior if the regime felt less threatened. The U.S. has repeatedly provided non-hostility declarations that promises not to attack North Korea with either conventional or nuclear weapons. And those documents in the past, and there have been at least 20, had no impact on North Korea's continued production of nuclear weapons. And why would this piece of paper, a peace declaration, be expected to have a greater impact than those previously provided pledges? A rushed declaration to end the Korean War could have serious negative consequences for the decades-old South Korean-U.S. alliance. Even a limited declaration could create a domino effect advocacy for prematurely signing a peace treaty, ending joint military drills, disbanding UN command, abrogating the Mutual Defense Treaty, and creating momentum in both South Korea and the U.S. for reduction or removal of U.S. forces before reducing the North Korean threat that necessitated the American presence here. And beyond security ramifications, a peace declaration could also lead to even greater advocacy for reducing U.S. and UN sanctions on North Korea. A peace declaration, quite simply, would be a historic but meaningless feel-good gesture that had no tangible benefits and did nothing to improve the security situation on the peninsula. Now, looking ahead to potential conventional arms reductions. Now, either perceived or presidential claims of success with North Korea could lead to premature advocacy for reducing the forces on the peninsula, as well as a reduction in South Korea's military budget and force levels beyond those that are already planned. Conversely, a continued stalemate in denuclearization talks might lead the Moon administration to offer up changes to the Allied military posture to induce progress. Either course would be a serious mistake. Any conventional force reduction should be part of a carefully crafted agreement with North Korea that clearly delineates all parties' responsibilities. These forces should be capped and then moved away from the forward area using measures similar to those of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, of which I was a member of the delegation. The CFE Treaty capped the number of NATO and Warsaw Pact tanks, artillery, combat vehicles, combat aircraft, and attack helicopters, and also included extensive provisions for destruction of excess treaty-limited items, notifications, information exchanges, and intrusive regimes of declared and non-declared facilities. The CFE Treaty reduced the potential for large-scale attack, as well as misperceptions of an impending invasion, by weaning the large military forces away from the delineating line between the two alliances. In my paper, I included a list of proposed confidence and security building measures for the Korean Peninsula. Now, the U.S. and South Korea, along with other UN member nations, must coordinate their policies to more effectively press North Korea to abandon its nuclear and missile program. So Washington should emphasize to Seoul that efforts to improve inter-Korean relations must not move forward without commensurate steps by North Korea to come into compliance with UN resolutions. There should be no economic benefits or sanctions reductions to North Korea without significant denuclearization steps by the regime. U.S. laws pertaining to North Korea's human rights violations, sponsoring acts of terrorism, and criminal activities such as money laundering require separate actions by the regime prior to their removal. A peace treaty formally ending the Korean War should be contingent on eliminating the North Korean nuclear threat and reducing the conventional threat rather than an opening gambit to improve relations with Pyongyang. The onus is on North Korea to take steps to overcome the current diplomatic stalemate. Pyongyang should pledge to immediately end nuclear and missile production, provide a data declaration of its nuclear and missile programs, agree to on-site inspections, and commit to dismantle those facilities and destroy its weapons of mass destruction arsenal. I've expressed many concerns, but I should emphasize that these concerns of the alliance are driven by the actions of policymakers, not the military of either country. Edmund Burke wrote, "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf." So while the diplomatic differences are being worked out, we should always remember and be thankful that the men and women of both militaries will continue to stand on the ramparts of freedom for our behalf. Kamsahamnida.